Around 969 BCE, the High Priests of Amun sealed the last of Egypt's greatest pharaohs inside a borrowed tomb cut into the Theban cliffs, and left no record of what they had done. For 3,000 years, no one knew where the mummy of Ramesses II had been taken. In 2021, CT scans began to expose what the priests had hidden. The tomb they chose had not been built as a royal cache. It was the family tomb of Pinedjem II himself, a high priest. A vertical shaft dropping 12 meters into the rock, opening into a corridor 70 meters long. By the time the priests were finished, that corridor held more than 50 royal mummies, coffins stacked against the walls. Some bore the names of the people inside them. Others did not. A few bore the names of someone else entirely. Then the shaft entrance was left to fill with sand and debris. No marker, no inscription. The cliff face absorbed it, and the desert moved on. It would take 2,850 years, a family of tomb robbers, a panicked clearance in 48 hours, and finally the beam of a CT scanner rotating around a bandaged face for the full weight of what the priests had done to become visible. What they concealed was not only 50 bodies. They concealed wounds. They concealed identities. They disassembled at least one king and reassembled him with linen and resin, then placed him back in his wrappings as though nothing had happened. They moved pharaohs into coffins that belonged to other people. And at least one royal male in that corridor has still not been examined with modern methods. His name unknown, his story untouched, sitting in a catalogue numbered 61067. This is the story of DB320, of what was sealed inside it, and of what a scanner found when it finally looked. History remembers what survives. Everything else we have to dig for. If that's the kind of history you came here for, subscribe to Neo History Reborn, new investigations into the ancient world, every week. And in the comments below, tell me which lost civilization you want us to uncover next. The tomb designated DB320, also recorded as TT320 in the Theban tomb registry, sits in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor. It was not discovered by archaeologists. It was found by a family. Sometime around 1871, Abdul Rasul Ahmed, a villager from Gurna, located the shaft entrance. For approximately a decade, the family made selective withdrawals from the cache, selling funerary papyri, shabtis, and small objects onto the Luxor antiquities market, in quantities that eventually drew attention. By 1881, Gaston Maspero, director of the Egyptian Service des Antiquités, had traced the objects back to their source. Under interrogation, one member of the family broke. On June 25, 1881, the location of DB320 was revealed to Egyptian authorities. Maspero dispatched Emile Brugsch, his assistant at the Bulak Museum, to clear the site. Brugsch descended the shaft on July 6, 1881. What he found in the corridor stopped him where he stood. Coffin after coffin, stacked in the lamplight. Name after royal name reading back at him from the painted wood. Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, Ahmose I, Amenhotep I. He made a decision. In 48 hours, July 6th and 7th, 1881, Brugsch oversaw the removal of nearly 6,000 funerary objects and more than 50 mummies. No positional record was made. No map of which coffin sat where, which mummy lay beside which object, which lids matched which bases. The spatial relationships that might have resolved the mismatched coffins, once destroyed, never reconstructed, were lost permanently in those 2 days. Maspero documented what arrived at Bulak in his 1889 publication, Les Momies Royales de Deir el-Bahari, still the primary record of the cache's contents. The mummies passed to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where most remained for over a century, until 22 were transferred to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization at Fustat on April 3, 2021, before CT scanning had finished telling us what we were actually looking at. When Brugg's team carried the coffins out into the Theban sunlight, the names on the outside did not always match what was inside. The mismatches only became apparent in Cairo, when Maspero's team began cross-referencing coffin inscriptions against the mummies they contained. The results complicated everything. Multiple royal mummies were found in coffins that did not belong to them. Some coffins bore royal names but held bodies whose identity could not be confirmed. Others held bodies whose original casings had apparently been lost or abandoned, somewhere in the decades-long transfer operation. A 2016 study by Michael Habecht and colleagues, published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, examined multiple 18th dynasty royal mummies from the Cache and found that several coffin inscription identifications could not be confirmed by morphological or radiological evidence. The coffins were not reliable witnesses. Whether the priests lost track across generations of transfers or made deliberate reassignments under crisis conditions, the result was the same. The evidentiary chain between a pharaoh's name and his face had been broken. What the priests were protecting is clear. Royal bodies moved out of robbed tombs during a period of systemic looting. That the Theban necropolis records document in detail what they could not fully preserve, or did not prioritize preserving, was the precise correspondence between identity and container that 3,000 years later we are still trying to reconstruct. The mummy of Seqenenre II had always looked wrong. He was a 17th dynasty king who ruled Thebes around 1558 BCE, during the period of Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt. His mummy showed severe cranial trauma visible to the naked eye, wounds so pronounced that 19th century scholars assumed a battlefield death. That much was not disputed. What was disputed was the mummification. The body was preserved with professional skill, the wounds partly filled beneath the surface with resin-based filler. For a king who supposedly died far from his royal workshops, the quality of the preservation was difficult to explain. In February 2021, Dr. Sahar Salim of Cairo University's Faculty of Medicine published a CT study of the Seqenenre mummy in Frontiers in Medicine. The scanner found wounds that had never been visible from the outside. Concealed beneath the embalming filler were additional facial lesions, injuries the embalmers had deliberately smoothed over. With a compound that Salim explicitly compared, in the study's language, to the function of modern plastic surgery. The surface presented to the world had been edited. 5 distinct wound profiles were identified, consistent with 5 different Hyksos weapons: a spear, 2 axes, a sword, and a blunt instrument. The pattern is consistent with multiple simultaneous attackers, not sequential blows from a single assailant. And Seqenenre's hands showed cadaveric spasm, the rigid muscular contraction that occurs only at the precise moment of death, consistent with his wrists having been bound behind his back when he died. The embalmers knew what had happened to him. They chose to partially conceal it. The priests who moved him into DB 322 centuries later sealed that concealment in the Theban cliffs and left it there for 3,000 years. Of all the mummies recovered from DB 320, one was considered too intact to touch. Amenhotep I, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1525 to 1504 BCE, was found exactly as the 21st dynasty priests had left him. Flower garlands still encircling his body, a cartonnage face mask with inlaid stone eyes and polychrome features, the bandaging undisturbed. Every other major royal mummy recovered from the cache had been unwrapped at some point. either by the ancient priests during their reburial operations or by 19th and early 20th century scholars. Amenhotep I had not. For 140 years, too beautiful, too fragile, too complete to disturb. His age at death was unconfirmed. The condition of his body beneath the bandages was unknown. His original tomb had never been conclusively identified. On December 28, 2021, Dr. Sahar Salim and Zahi Hawass published a CT digital unwrapping in Frontiers in Medicine. The scanner passed through the bandages without touching them. Amenhotep I died at approximately 35 years of age. No obvious wounds, cause of death remains unknown. 30 amulets of gold and semi-precious stone were distributed through his wrappings, packed into the bandaging by embalmers before sealing. His head had been detached from his body after death, separated at the neck, then reattached by the 21st dynasty priests, using resin-treated linen before rewrapping him. They had disassembled a pharaoh, reassembled him, wrapped him in fresh linen, placed a cartonnage mask over his reconstructed face, carried him into a shaft in the Theban cliffs, and sealed the entrance. His original tomb remains unlocated. At the far end of the corridor, in a coffin inscribed for a scribe named Nebseni, a minor official with no royal connection, the clearance team found a mummy that fit nothing around it. Egyptian Museum Catalogue, number 61067. In the scholarly literature, Unknown Man C. Grafton Elliott Smith, who conducted the first systematic anatomical examination of the DB 320 mummies, noted an anomaly, the absence of genitalia, suggesting possible castration before or at the time of death. The mummification quality, the context, the placement within a cache otherwise dominated by royal and high priestly burials, all consistent with someone of significant status. But no identifying text accompanied the body. Some researchers have proposed identification with the Pharaoh A, who ruled briefly after Tutankhamun, and whose tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found largely stripped. The connection rests on circumstantial alignment and remains unconfirmed. Here is the anomaly that separates Man C from every other mummy in this corridor. He has not been examined with CT imaging. Not in 2021. Not since. Catalog number 61067 sits in a museum. The scanner exists. Who he was? A pharaoh, a priest, someone whose erasure was so complete that even the priests who moved him left no label, remains entirely unanswered. That is not a mystery of the ancient world. That is a choice being made right now. For most of the 20th century, what Egyptologists knew about the DB 320 mummies was limited to what could be learned from the outside. Visual examination, physical unwrapping where it had already occurred. X-ray imaging introduced to Egyptian mummy studies in the 1960s, which could detect foreign objects inside the wrappings, but could not resolve surface tissue, distinguish wound types, or map the fine structure of embalming interventions. What the priests had concealed beneath resin filler and fresh linen was invisible to every examination method available until the 21st century. CT scanning changed the terms of the problem entirely. Computed tomography rotates an X-ray source around an object and reconstructs the data into a three-dimensional model. Applied to a mummy, it produces a complete internal map without disturbing a single layer of wrapping. Every amulet, every bone fracture, every filled wound cavity, every repaired joint. The scanner reads through 3,000 years of linen as though it were not there. Dr. Sahar Salim, professor of radiology at Cairo University's Faculty of Medicine, and radiologist of the Egyptian Mummy Project, built the comparative baseline those studies required. Years of scanning royal and non-royal mummies from the Egyptian Museum collection, against which the DB 320 anomalies could be precisely measured. What the two 2021 studies demonstrated, taken together, was not merely information about two individual kings. The resin filler concealing Seqenenre's wounds was not crude patchwork. It required professional knowledge of facial anatomy and embalming chemistry. The reassembly of Amenhotep I's detached head, bound with resin-treated linen, sealed beneath fresh wrappings, showed the same level of deliberate technical skill. These were not people acting in haste. They were skilled practitioners deciding, with precision, what would and would not be visible. The CT scanner did not find careless concealment. It found careful concealment, not merely a hiding place. A managed archive curated by people who understood exactly what they were preserving and exactly what they were editing out. The new kingdom was ending. By the time the 21st dynasty began, around 1070 BCE, the pharaohs of the 20th dynasty, the last of the Ramessides, could no longer pay their own workforce. Egypt had split. A pharaoh ruling in name from Tanis in the delta, the High Priests of Amun at Karnak, holding the south in everything but name. Into this fracture, tomb robbery entered on an industrial scale. The tomb robbery papyri, records of necropolis inspections dating to the reigns of Ramesses IX and XI, document systematic looting across the Theban West Bank. Tombs opened, bodies disturbed, grave goods stripped. The high priests responded with a decades-long operation, moving through compromised tombs, collecting the royal bodies, rewrapping the damaged, relocating the rest. It concluded with the burial of Pinedjem II, himself a high priest, around 969 BCE. When Pinedjem II was interred in DB 320, the shaft was sealed for the last time. But the relocation was also, inescapably, an editorial operation. Strip a mummy from its original tomb, place it in a communal corridor beside 50 other bodies, some in their own coffins, some in borrowed ones, some with no coffin at all. The historical record is compressed, reduced to a wrapped body with a label, and in some cases, not even a correct label. This is what the CT scans have begun to reverse. When Salim's scanner mapped Seqenenre's wounds, it was recovering evidence of a king's final moments, evidence the embalming process had partially obscured. When it passed through Amenhotep I's bandages and found 30 amulets and a reattached head, it was reading the work of priests who had disassembled and reconstructed a pharaoh, a restoration no human eye had seen for 3,000 years. What was sealed inside DB 320 was not only the bodies of kings, it was the record of what had happened to them. Wounds, disassembly, mismatched identities, anonymous royals placed in scribes' coffins. The priests were the last people who knew the full truth of that corridor. When they sealed the shaft and walked away, they took that knowledge with them. The CT scanner is the first instrument since 969 BCE, capable of reading what they left behind. And it has not finished reading. Man C remains unexamined. Amenhotep I's original tomb remains unlocated. How many DB 320 identifications are correct? And how many reflect the accumulated uncertainty of a decades-long crisis operation? Is still open. The priests of the 21st dynasty were not, by the standards of their own world, engaged in a cover-up. They were performing an act of devotion. The tomb robbery papyri are not metaphor. The tombs were being opened. The mummies were being unwrapped for their amulets. The threat was real, and the priestly response was, within its own logic, an act of conservation. The concealment was not malicious. It was consequential. The wounds on Seqenenre's face were hidden because a professional embalmer made a decision about a king's presentation, governed by ritual considerations that had nothing to do with the 21st century. The head reattached to Amenhotep I was reattached because the priests chose to restore his physical integrity before rewrapping him, as their religious obligations required. What we are reading through the CT scanner is not ancient conspiracy. It is ancient decision-making, made under pressure, by skilled people, for whom the physical body of a king retained permanent significance, and yet the consequence of those decisions, preserved by the sand that filled the shaft, by Brugsch's chaotic clearance, by a century of institutional restraint, is access to something genuinely rare, a layered record, not just of how these kings died, but of how the people who came after them chose to manage that fact. The priests edited. The scanner reads the edits. Man C is still waiting. The original tomb of Amenhotep I is still missing, but the shaft is open, and the scanner is still running. Somewhere in the Egyptian Museum catalogue, a mummy numbered 61067 is waiting for a scanner that has not yet been pointed at him. We know his wrappings. We know the coffin he was found in, a coffin that belonged to someone else. We know that Grafton Elliott Smith noted anomalies he could not explain. We know every other major mummy from DB 320 has now been imaged or formally assessed with modern methods. We do not know who he is. That question has remained open not because the evidence is gone, but because no one has yet done the work. If you want to follow what the scanner finds next, in DB 320, in the Valley of the Kings, in the sites beneath Egypt that have not yet been opened, subscribe to this channel. And if you have a thought about Man C, who he might have been, why the priests placed him in a scribe's coffin, leave it in the comments. The question is genuinely open. The next video is already waiting. It concerns a structure visible for 3,000 years, that every major expedition walked past, until a single instrument revealed it to be something no one had mapped before. It is on screen now.